The Valorian Empire had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years, and their fleets moved through space like storms that nothing could stop. Every species they found either surrendered or died, and this pattern never changed in their long history of conquest. Admiral Krell stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the reports about a small yellow star at the edge of explored space. The third planet from that star showed signs of intelligent life, but they seemed primitive compared to Valorian technology. Krell ordered his communications officer to send the standard warning that gave the planet 1 day to surrender. But before the message could be sent, an old transmission interrupted them. The message came from an ancient relay station and carried a timestamp from 50,000 years ago. The warning was clear and direct about a system called Terra being under permanent protection, and any military vessels coming within 10 light years would face total destruction. Krell laughed at the message because the ancients were just myths and stories told to scare children, and no civilization could last that long. He dismissed the warning and ordered his fleet of 300 warships to move forward toward the planet called Earth Deep. Beneath the Rocky Mountains on Earth, a man named Jake Morrison sat in a fortified command center and watched the alien fleet approach on massive displays. He picked up a red phone that connected directly to the president and told her the aliens had ignored the warning and crossed the boundary line. President Helen Grant asked if their people were ready, and Jake confirmed that Lisa Hayes and her team on the lunar base were prepared, along with Rick Palmer, commanding the orbital defense platforms. Jake mentioned the others who were waiting, and Helen understood what he meant because 15 years ago humanity had learned they were not alone, and more importantly, they were protected by something ancient and powerful. A damaged space probe had been returned to Earth with a message inside that was not meant for humans but for anyone who might threaten them, and the message made it clear that Earth had guardians who had been watching for thousands of years. Helen gave the order to activate Protocol Lighthouse, and across the planet, buried installations came to life as ancient alien technology merged with human engineering. Lisa activated the first beacon on the moon, and a pulse of energy rippled out into space like a stone dropped in water. The Valorian fleet detected the energy pulse immediately, and Krell frowned as his sensors showed readings that made no sense because space itself seemed to be bending in impossible ways. His tactical officer reported massive energy signatures appearing throughout the system, but they were not coming from Earth, and they were everywhere at once. The Guardian ships appeared without warning and surrounded the Valorian fleet in a perfect sphere, and these vessels were huge compared to even the largest Valorian battlecruiser. The ships had no visible weapons or engines, and they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and they moved with grace that defied physics. One Guardian positioned itself directly in front of Krell's flagship and opened a communication channel, but no voice came through, and instead images flooded the Valorian systems showing other empires and other fleets that had made the same mistake Krell was making. The images showed what happened to those fleets afterward, and there was nothing left of them but empty space where proud armadas had been moments before. Rick Palmer watched from Earth's orbital platform as the alien fleet began retreating in panic, and his console showed the Guardian ship simply watching without pursuing or attacking, but just being present as a reminder. He reported that all Valorian vessels were breaking formation and jumping away to hyperspace as fast as their engines could carry them. In the command bunker, Jake allowed himself a small smile, and Lisa's voice came through his earpiece from the moon saying it looked like the warning still carried weight after all these years. Helen Grant ordered the defensive systems to stand down and told her staff to send a message to the Valorian homeworld through diplomatic channels reminding them that Earth was protected and had always been protected, and any future approach would be met with the same response. As the last Valorian ship vanished from sensors, the Guardian vessels faded away just as mysteriously as they had arrived, but Jake knew they were not really gone because they never were. Somewhere beyond normal space and beyond human understanding, they watched over Earth, and they had been watching for thousands of years, and would continue watching. Earth was not just another planet in the galaxy, but something special and something worth protecting, and humanity was only beginning to understand why. The Valorian retreat sent shockwaves through the galactic community, and within days every major civilization knew about what happened at the edge of explored space. An unknown species called humans lived on a planet that ancient Guardians protected with technology that surpassed anything the galaxy had seen in recorded history. The elder species who had been spacefaring for tens of thousands of years shared knowing looks, because they had always known about the warning around system, Terra but younger civilizations. Like the Valorians were too arrogant to believe ancient messages. On Earth, the leadership gathered to discuss what the encounter meant for humanity's future, because they now knew they were not alone in the universe, but they also knew they were isolated by the very protection that kept them safe. Helen addressed her cabinet and military commanders, and told them they had been given time behind an impenetrable shield, but they could not hide forever, and eventually humanity would need to stand on its own in a galaxy that now knew they existed. 3 months passed since the Valorian fleet fled from Earth, and the Galactic Council convened an emergency session at the neutral station where representatives from 27 member species gathered to discuss the mystery of Earth and its impossible guardians. Ambassador Vren of the Valorian Empire stood before the council, with his proud bearing diminished by recent humiliation, and presented holographic evidence showing the encounter with the Guardian ships and his fleet's hasty retreat. Vren demanded an explanation about what weapons humanity possessed and what treaty bound these protector vessels to their cause, but Council Prime Shorak, who was a crystalline being whose species had been spacefaring for 30,000 years, responded that the Valorian Empire demanded much for one who violated the oldest prohibition in recorded galactic history. A murmur rippled through the assembled delegates because many younger species looked confused, but the elder races shared knowing glances about something they had kept secret. Shorak continued, explaining that the quarantine zone around system Terra had existed since before the council itself was formed, and his people's ancestors had recorded the warning and honored it for 28,000 years, and the fact that Valorians chose to ignore it spoke to their arrogance on Earth. News of the council session reached human leadership through carefully monitored alien communications, and in Geneva, at the newly established Earth Defense headquarters, a man named Paul Chen assembled his top analysts to review what was happening. Nina Foster, who was an expert on alien languages, pulled up translated transcripts showing that older species knew something about Earth but were not sharing their knowledge, and 3 separate delegations had requested direct communication with humanity. Paul asked what they were requesting, and Nina explained they wanted permission to send unarmed scout ships to study the Guardian vessels and understand their technology. The Sholan Combine was offering a full technology exchange, while the Keltar Federation proposed a mutual defense pact that would benefit both sides. Ben Carter, who headed Earth's newly formed Space Force, shook his head and said the aliens wanted to use humanity as a shield, because if Earth was protected, they thought they could hide behind that protection. Sophie Mills, who worked at her station analyzing data, pointed out that every major power was repositioning fleets to defensive postures, and none of them were pointing at each other but all facing toward Earth's sector of space. Paul made his decision quickly and told his team to draft a response that was polite, but firm, stating that Earth was not accepting visitors, whether armed or unarmed, and humanity was not interested in alliances or technology exchanges until they better understood their own situation. While diplomats crafted careful messages, other people pursued more direct investigation, and a man named Alex Ryan led a small research team aboard the orbital station Gateway with a mission to find out who the Guardians were and why they protected Earth. Alex explained during a video conference with Ground Command that his team had been analyzing energy signatures from the Guardian ships, and the readings did not match anything in human physics because the spatial distortions suggested the ships were not moving through space in any conventional sense, but manipulating space itself and maybe even time. Paul asked if they had detected any residual presence or any sign the Guardians were still watching, and Alex glanced at his colleague Henry Brooks before answering. Alex explained they had deployed a network of quantum sensors around the solar system, and most of the time readings were normal, but occasionally, maybe once every few days, they detected brief anomalies as if something was there, watching, and then disappeared before they could get a solid reading on it. Back at the Galactic Council, a secret meeting took place, away from curious sensors, where 5 representatives from the galaxy's oldest civilizations gathered in a shielded chamber. Elder Mira of the Tallinn Collective said the humans were asking questions and had deployed detection grids and were actively searching for the Guardians. Keeper Voth of the Shen Commonwealth responded that humans had every right to search because anyone would do the same in their situation. Mira pressed the issue, asking if humans understood the danger because the Guardians protected them, But that protection came with conditions that were set long before humans evolved intelligence. Shorak agreed and explained that the precursors who left the Guardians had done so for specific reasons, because Earth was a seed world, and one of only 12 known to exist in the entire galaxy. The genetic diversity and evolutionary potential of Earth meant humans were inheritors of something profound that they did not yet realize. Ambassador Krell of the Xanthor Unity asked through telepathic thoughts if they should tell humanity the truth, and warned them that their protected status was temporary. The eldest among them, who was Chronicler Tash of the Vex Archive, spoke for the first time, and his words carried the weight of 40,000 years of recorded history. Tash explained that the precursor's message was clear, about Earth being protected until humanity reached a certain threshold of development, and once they became a true spacefaring civilization and established permanent colonies beyond their system, the Guardians would depart. Keeper Voth asked quietly what would happen after the Guardians left, and Tash replied that humanity would face the galaxy on their own terms, as every species must eventually do. Sophie Mills was working late at Earth Defense Headquarters when she made a breakthrough by cross-referencing ancient alien databases, looking for any mention of Earth or the Sol system in historical records. Most searches came up empty or contradictory, but one archive yielded something different, and Sophie called out to Paul Chen with excitement in her voice. Paul hurried to her station along with Nina and several other analysts, and on the screen was a translated document from the Vex archive dated approximately 47,000 years ago. Sophie explained it was a catalog of protected worlds, and the precursors had designated certain planets as forbidden to interference, and Earth was listed along with 11 other worlds. Sophie highlighted a passage that Nina read aloud, describing how these worlds harbored genetic templates of crucial importance and were reservoirs of adaptive potential to be preserved until their dominant species achieved technological and philosophical maturity. The Guardian protocols would remain active until maturity thresholds were met, and the room fell silent as everyone understood what this meant. Ben Carter said quietly that humanity was in a zoo or a cosmic nature preserve, but Nina corrected him, saying it was more like a garden being tended until they were ready for something. Paul shook his head because they did not know the full truth, but this information changed everything. And if the protection was conditional and ended, when humanity reached some unknown threshold, then they needed to be prepared for that day. That night, Paul sent encrypted orders to commanders across Earth's defense network because humanity had been given a gift of time to grow stronger behind an impenetrable shield, but gifts always came with conditions, and the galaxy was watching to see what humanity would do when those conditions were met and the shield came down. 6 months after Earth's encounter with the Valorian fleet, humanity's presence in space had expanded dramatically as construction crews worked day and night on 3 new orbital stations, and preliminary surveys had identified ideal locations for colonies on Mars and Europa. The urgency was clear among Earth's leadership because if the Guardian protection was temporary, then humanity needed to be ready to stand alone when that protection ended. Not everyone in the galaxy was content to wait and watch, because the Kryn Syndicate was not a government but traders and explorers, and when opportunity presented itself, they were pirates. Their leader was a scarred veteran named Torval, who listened with great interest to stories about Earth and its mysterious protectors, and unlike the major empires, the Syndicate had little to lose and much to gain from taking risks. Torval told his assembled captains that the Guardians only responded to military threats because the Valorians had come with warships and hostile intent. But what if someone approached peacefully as traders instead? His second-in-command, who was a cunning female named Syrah, clicked her claws thoughtfully and said it was risky, because the old species feared that system for good reasons. Torval countered that old species were cautious because they had much to protect, but the Syndicate was already outside galactic laws, and he believed the risk was worth taking because a single human specimen or a few samples of their technology would be worth millions on the black market. 3 weeks later, a small Kryn vessel dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Earth's solar system, bearing no weapons and only standard markings of a commercial trader. Its transponder broadcast peaceful intentions in 17 languages as it slowly approached the inner system. On Gateway Station, alarms sounded immediately, and Alex Ryan pulled up sensor data with a grim expression and told his crew they had an unauthorized vessel at the system boundary. Lisa Hayes, who had transferred from the lunar base to Gateway after her service during the Valorian Incident asked if there was any Guardian response yet, and Alex replied there was none because the ship was not displaying hostile behavior, but that did not mean they were friendly. Paul Chen joined the call from Earth and told Alex to hail them and find out what they wanted, and the communication was answered immediately. Torval's face appeared on screen with his translator working smoothly as he introduced himself and said they came in peace, seeking only to establish trade relations and meant no harm. Alex responded carefully that this system was closed to outside contact, and they were not accepting visitors at this time, but Torval asked if humanity intended to remain isolated forever. Torval said they could offer much to Earth, including technology and star charts and cultural exchanges, and all they asked was the opportunity to meet face-to-face and discuss mutual benefits. While the conversation continued, Sophie Mills worked frantically at her station analyzing the Kryn ship's trajectory and scanning patterns, and something felt wrong about the whole situation. Sophie called out quietly to Alex and pulled up a separate display, showing that the alien sensors were operating well beyond normal passive scans and they were doing deep penetration sweeps of Earth's orbital infrastructure. Sophie explained this was not simple reconnaissance because they were looking for vulnerabilities in human defenses, like pirates would do before a raid. Alex's jaw tightened and he muted the communication channel and told Lisa to get security protocol beta in place, because if these pirates made a move, he wanted them boxed in immediately. Lisa confirmed she was already working on it as her fingers flew across her console preparing the trap. Back on the channel, Torval was growing more insistent, saying that surely Earth's leaders could spare a moment for peaceful discussion, and they had traveled far, and the least humans could offer was courtesy. His words cut off as 6 human spacecraft emerged from behind the moon with weapon systems powered, but not locked on target, and their positioning was tactically perfect to surround the Kryn ship. Alex said firmly that it was time for them to leave the system, immediately. For a moment, Torval's friendly mask slipped, revealing cold calculation beneath, but then he smiled again and said, of course they meant no offense, but humanity should know that the galaxy was not as patient as they might hope, and others would come, and not all would be as understanding as the Kryn syndicate. The Kryn ship began turning away, but Sierra's voice crackled over their internal communication, saying she was detecting spatial anomalies forming around them from multiple sources at close proximity. Torval's eyes widened as his sensors confirmed what she was seeing, because the Guardian ships were appearing, and not in front of them, but surrounding them in a perfect sphere. Unlike during the Valorian encounter, these vessels were much closer, and their presence was oppressive and undeniable as they trapped the Kryn ship in a cage of impossible technology. Torval shouted to retreat immediately, but his pilot was already trying as the ship's engines flared to maximum power and attempted to jump to hyperspace, but the space around them had changed. The Guardian vessels had created some kind of field that prevented faster-than-light travel, and the Kryn ship was completely trapped with no way to escape. On Gateway Station, Alex watched in fascination as the Guardians maintained their formation without attacking or making threats, but simply containing the pirates. Paul said over the communication channel that this was a warning and told Alex to relay a message to the Kryn vessel. Alex told Torval that if they powered down their engines and drifted out of the system on conventional thrust, the Guardians would let them go, but if they tried anything hostile, they would likely be destroyed. After a tense moment of consideration, Torval had no choice but to comply because fighting was suicide, and the Kryn ship began its slow exit from the solar system. The journey took 3 days at conventional speeds, and during those 3 days the entire crew experienced firsthand what it meant to be at the mercy of beings far beyond their understanding as the Guardian ships followed them in perfect formation. When the Kryn vessel finally crossed the boundary line, the mysterious ships simply vanished as if they had never existed, leaving the pirates shaken and humiliated. News of the incident spread through the galactic underworld like wildfire, and within weeks the Kryn syndicate's reputation was in tatters because Torval had been made an example of and allowed to live only so he could tell others what happened when Earth's boundaries were tested. The incident had consequences beyond criminal networks because, at Earth Defense Headquarters, Paul Chen called an emergency meeting and told the Joint Chiefs and civilian leadership they needed to talk about what just happened. Paul explained that the Guardians had responded to a non-military threat which changed their understanding of the protection parameters completely. Admiral Kate Wilson, who was head of naval operations, nodded and said the Guardians were not just preventing invasion, but enforcing total isolation, because any unauthorized contact triggered a response. Nina Foster said quietly that this meant humanity was not protected in the traditional sense, but quarantined, and there was an important difference between the two. Ben Carter leaned forward and asked the crucial question about why the precursors wanted humanity locked away, and what made them so dangerous or so valuable that such extreme measures were necessary. Sophie Mills had been studying the Guardian ship movements during the incident and pulled up a holographic replay showing their formation pattern, which was not random but mathematically precise, suggesting they followed programmed protocols rather than making tactical decisions. Sophie explained the Guardians were machines, or something like machines, that were incredibly advanced, but still following rules set down thousands of years ago. Paul asked if anyone could communicate with them, and Alex replied via video link that they had tried every known frequency and every standard galactic protocol but got nothing because the Guardians did not respond to hails and did not acknowledge human presence, except when enforcement was required. President Helen Grant joined the meeting with a troubled expression and said humanity was alone in a very real sense because they were protected by forces they did not understand, from threats they could not fully gauge, and isolated from potential allies or sources of knowledge. Nina interjected that humanity was not entirely alone because some species knew more than they were telling, and the elder races who had been around for tens of thousands of years had known about Earth all this time and could help humanity understand if they chose to share their knowledge. Paul made a decision and told his team to draft a message to the Galactic Council, not asking for help but offering dialogue by framing it as humanity being willing to share what they had learned about the Guardians in exchange for historical context. As the meeting ended, Alex remained on the video link and told Paul there was something else, because during the incident their quantum sensors had picked up anomalous readings again, but this time they were different and stronger and more focused. Alex said it felt like the Guardians were studying humanity as much as they were containing the Kryn ship, and he got the feeling that humans were being evaluated for something. Paul asked what they were being evaluated for, and Alex replied he did not know, but he had a strong feeling that whatever threshold the precursors had set was getting closer. And the response from the Galactic Council came 3 months after Earth's offer of dialogue, and to humanity's surprise, it was not an official diplomatic message, but a private communication directed specifically to Paul Chen. The sender was chronicler Tash of the Vex Archive, who was one of the eldest beings in known space, and Paul announced to his core team at Earth Defense Headquarters that the elder species wanted to meet in person. Tash was willing to come to Earth along with representatives from 4 other ancient civilizations, with no security detail and no conditions except a small diplomatic shuttle to make the journey. Admiral Kate Wilson frowned and said it could be a trick where they send in a small ship to get past the Guardians and then signal for reinforcements once inside. Nina Foster countered that if the elder species wanted to attack Earth, they had 40,000 years to figure out how to get past the Guardians, and she thought they were genuine because the ancient civilizations had always maintained the quarantine. Paul looked at the message again and explained that Tash said they would arrive in 2 weeks at a neutral orbital point and were asking permission to enter human space peacefully because the Guardians would recognize their credentials, apparently. Ben Carter asked how they would know that the Guardians recognized anything, and Sophie Mills pulled up her latest research, explaining she thought the elder species had been to Earth before. Sophie had been digging through old Earth records and archaeological sites and ancient texts, and there were too many coincidences, including references to visitors from the stars and beings of light descending from the heavens, and knowledge appearing suddenly in primitive cultures. Sophie suggested that the elder species had been checking on humanity periodically throughout history, and the decision was made that Earth would receive its first official alien visitors. 2 weeks later, Alex Ryan stood on the observation deck of Gateway Station as a small, elegant spacecraft approached that was unlike any design in Earth's databases because it was sleek and organic, looking as if grown rather than built. The docking procedure went smoothly, and within an hour, 5 alien beings stood in Gateway's diplomatic suite. Chronicler Tash was there with his ancient eyes taking in everything with patient interest, and beside him stood Elder Mira of the Talene, Collective, and Council Prime Shorak of the Crystalline Unity. and Keeper Voth of the Shen Commonwealth, and Ambassador Krell of the Xanthor, whose telepathic presence filled the room with a sense of calm. Paul Chen led the human delegation accompanied by President Helen Grant via secure holographic link, along with Nina and Ben and Sophie, who were eager to learn the truth. The formalities were brief because Tash had not traveled across the galaxy for ceremony, and he began by saying they had come to tell humanity the truth about Earth and about the Guardians, and about their place in the grand design of the galaxy. Tash activated a holographic display that filled the center of the room, showing the galaxy as it had been 50,000 years ago, and he explained that the precursors were a civilization unlike any that came before or since. The precursors had achieved technological transcendence and mastered the fundamental forces of reality itself. But in their exploration of the cosmos, they discovered something troubling, because the galaxy was becoming stagnant. The display shifted, showing various alien species in their evolutionary development, and Elder Mira added that life was abundant, but true innovation was rare because species would develop to a certain point, and then plateau. Species would become comfortable and stable, but ultimately limited, and the precursors realized that without periodic infusions of new perspectives and new ways of thinking, the galaxy would eventually die of its own success. Shorak explained that the precursors created a solution by identifying 12 worlds throughout the galaxy that were planets with exceptional genetic diversity and evolutionary potential. These were worlds where life was developing along unique pathways unburdened by contact with existing galactic civilization, and the display zoomed in to show Earth, along with 11 other planets scattered across the galaxy. Keeper Voth explained these were the seed worlds, and the precursors placed them under protection and established the Guardians to enforce total isolation, and then the precursors transcended to whatever lies beyond normal understanding, leaving the galaxy to be renewed by the species that would eventually emerge from these preserved worlds. President Grant leaned forward in her holographic form and asked if humanity was part of an experiment or a genetic diversity project spanning thousands of years. Ambassador Krell corrected her through careful telepathic thoughts, saying it was not an experiment but a gift, because the precursors understood that every species has unique value and unique perspectives shaped by their homeworld and evolutionary path. Earth's protection was not about keeping humanity prisoner, but about giving them the freedom to develop without outside influence and to become truly themselves before facing the greater galaxy. Paul asked about the other 11 worlds, and Tash's expression grew somber as he explained that 6 had reached the maturity threshold and emerged from protection and joined galactic civilization, bringing innovations that others could never have imagined. 2 seed worlds were destroyed by natural disasters before their guardian protection could expire, and 1 destroyed itself through nuclear war, just as it reached the threshold of maturity. 2 others, including Earth, remained under protection, waiting for their time to emerge. Sophie spoke up with her analytical mind racing and asked what exactly determined when a species had reached the maturity threshold. Shorak answered that permanent self-sustaining colonies beyond the home system was the marker, because when a species demonstrated it could survive and thrive without depending solely on its birth world, the Guardians would recognize that as the signal to withdraw. The precursors believed this showed a species was ready to face the galaxy's challenges on equal footing with others. Ben observed that the elder species were telling humanity this information now before they had reached that threshold, and asked why they were sharing this knowledge early. The 5 elders exchanged glances, and finally Tash spoke again, saying the reason was because humanity was developing faster than any of the previous seed worlds. Human ingenuity and competitive drive and diversity of thought meant they had made more progress in a century than most species made in a millennium, and projections showed that humanity would establish its first permanent off-world colony within the next 5 years. Nina said slowly that when humanity did this, the Guardians would leave, and Mira confirmed this was correct. When the protection ended, humanity would be vulnerable because the Valorian Empire had not forgotten their humiliation, and the Kryn Syndicate wanted revenge, and there were other powers that saw Earth as either a threat or a prize. When the protection ended, humanity would face challenges unlike anything in their history, and the room fell silent as the implications sank in. Paul said finally that this was why the elders were here, because they came not just to explain, but to help humanity prepare for what was coming. Keeper Voth nodded and explained they were offering what they could, including technology transfers and military training and diplomatic guidance. The elders could not fight humanity's battles because that would defeat the precursors' entire purpose, but they could give humans the tools to fight those battles themselves. President Grant asked why the elders would help humanity and what they gained from this arrangement. Shorak chimed simply that the answer was survival, because the 6 species that emerged from Guardian protection had revolutionized galactic civilization. Medical advances extended lifespans by centuries, and new forms of energy solved resource crises, and philosophical frameworks prevented wars. And each seed world species brought something desperately needed that established civilizations could not develop themselves because they had grown too set in their ways. Tash added that they believed humanity would do the same, because human art and literature and scientific methods and social structures were already unlike anything the galaxy had seen. When humanity joined the galactic community as equals, the entire galaxy would benefit, but only if humans survived the transition period. Admiral Wilson, who had been listening via communication link, asked what kind of timeline they were looking at and how long humanity had to prepare. Mira explained that the Mars Colony Project would trigger the threshold when it became self-sustaining and able to produce its own food and air and maintain its population without regular supply runs from Earth. Based on current plans and progress, the elders estimated between 4 and 7 years before this happened. Paul stood and walked to the viewport looking out at Earth hanging in space below, and behind him he heard the continued discussion of technology, transfers and training programs and defensive strategies, but his mind was on the bigger picture. Humanity had been given a gift of thousands of years to grow strong behind an unbreakable shield, but gifts always came due eventually, and the bill for this one was about to arrive. Paul turned back to the assembled group of both humans and aliens and said they had work to do because if humanity was going to stand on its own, they needed to be ready for anything. No more isolation and no more relying on ancient protectors, because they would prepare for the day when they faced the galaxy as. 4 years later, the transformation of humanity's presence in space was staggering, and the Mars colony called New Hope had grown from an outpost of 50 scientists to a thriving settlement of 1,500 people. Vast underground hydroponics farms produced more food than the colony needed, and water extractors pulled moisture from the Martian soil and atmosphere, while fusion reactors hummed with clean, abundant energy. Paul Chen, who was now Earth's Secretary of Interstellar Affairs, stood in the colony's central observation dome beside Colony Director Lisa Hayes, and through the transparent dome they could see the red Martian landscape now dotted with lights from expanding infrastructure. Lisa said quietly that they were 3 weeks away from being officially self-sustaining, and after that, they would not need regular supply runs from Earth because they would be producing surplus resources. Paul nodded as he watched workers in pressure suits installing another solar array in the distance and said 3 weeks, until the Guardians left Earth vulnerable. The past 4 years had been a whirlwind of preparation because the elder species had been true to their word and provided technological assistance that accelerated Earth's development by decades. New weapon systems and advanced propulsion technology and improved materials science had transformed human capabilities, but more importantly, the elders had shared tactical knowledge about how galactic powers fought and what strategies worked and what mistakes to avoid. Earth's Space Force had grown from a few dozen experimental craft to a fleet of 300 ships that were not as large as Valorian battlecruisers or as numerous as the fleets of major empires, but they were human-designed and built with lessons learned from centuries of Earth's military history enhanced by alien technology. Admiral Kate Wilson commanded the fleet from the newly commissioned flagship Liberty, and she ran constant drills pushing her crews to be ready for threats they could only imagine. Military preparation was only part of the equation because Nina Foster had led a massive diplomatic initiative, and over the past 4 years, humanity had established formal relations with 17 alien species. Trade agreements had been signed and cultural exchanges initiated, and mutual defense pacts carefully negotiated because not everyone in the galaxy wanted Earth to fail. The Shalon Combine in particular had proven to be valuable allies because their territory bordered the Valorian Empire, and they had no love for their aggressive neighbors, and Ambassador Krell of the Xanthor had facilitated an agreement stating that when the Guardian protection ended, human ships would be granted sanctuary, in Cholon space if needed. The most crucial development had happened quietly, away from public attention, because Alex Ryan, who was now head of Earth's intelligence division, had uncovered something disturbing. The Valorian Empire had spent the past 4 years building a massive invasion fleet in secret and hiding the construction in remote star systems far from prying eyes. Admiral Vren, who was the same Valorian who had been humiliated before the Galactic Council, was commanding the operation and planning revenge. Alex reported during a secure council meeting that the Valorians were planning to hit Earth the moment the Guardian stood down and Sophie Mills, who was his deputy director, pulled up reconnaissance data on the main display showing over 800 warships. Sophie said grimly that the Valorians had been gathering them slowly and using civilian transports to avoid detection, and they were positioned just outside the Guardian perimeter, waiting for the protection to end. President Helen Grant, who was now in her second term, looked around the table at her advisors and asked if humanity could win against those numbers. Admiral Wilson shook her head and said not in a direct fight, because Earth would be outnumbered nearly 3-1, but they did not have to win because they just had to survive long enough for the Valorians to realize the cost was too high. Ben Carter, who was now general of Earth's ground forces, added that they had fortified every major installation in the system, including Mars and the lunar base, and the orbital platforms, and even Europa Station. If the Valorians wanted to take human territory, they would have to fight for every meter of it. Paul said quietly that the Valorians would fight because Vren was not coming for conquest but for revenge, and this was personal for him. And the room fell silent as they contemplated what was coming. 3 weeks later, on a clear morning, in New Hope Colony, Lisa Hayes received the alert she had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Her operations chief reported that all systems were nominal and they had achieved full self-sufficiency as of early morning, and congratulated the director on making New Hope officially independent from Earth. Lisa felt a mixture of pride and fear as she ordered her staff to notify Earth and get everyone to shelter stations because it was time for battle. Positions across all colonies. Throughout the solar system, alarms sounded, and on Gateway Station, Alex monitored sensor arrays with intense focus and announced that quantum readings were spiking because the Guardians were responding to the threshold trigger. Across Earth's surface and throughout its orbital infrastructure, billions of people watched their screens as humanity's ancient protectors appeared for the last time. The Guardian vessels materialized as they always had, with their mysterious and magnificent dark forms seeming to absorb the light around them, but this time they did not maintain their positions because this time they began to fade. Someone whispered on the command channel that the Guardians were leaving, and within minutes the Guardian ships had vanished completely. For the first time in over 50,000 years, Earth stood unprotected and vulnerable to whatever the galaxy would throw at them. Admiral Wilson did not waste a moment and ordered all ships to battle Formation Alpha and told her fleet to prepare for incoming hostiles. The Valorian fleet appeared, barely an hour later, dropping out of hyperspace at the system's edge in perfect formation, and 800 warships, each one a nightmare of destructive potential, arrayed like a mechanical plague descending on helpless prey. Admiral Vren stood on his flagship's bridge with his 4 eyes gleaming with anticipation and said finally, there were no more ancient Guardians and no more mysterious protectors, but just the Valorians and the humans. Today they would remind the galaxy why the Valorian Empire was feared across known space. Vren opened a channel to Earth and told the humans they had one opportunity to surrender and accept Valorian rule or be destroyed, and they had 10 minutes to decide. On the Liberty, Admiral Wilson muted the channel and looked at her command crew, and Paul Chen was on the bridge with her as a civilian observer and the voice of Earth's government. Paul said firmly there would be no surrender, because humanity did not prepare for 4 years just to give up at the first threat. Wilson smiled grimly and said she was hoping he would say that, and she opened the all-ships channel. Wilson told all Earth forces that their ancestors built nations that stood against tyranny and crossed oceans to explore the unknown, and reached for the stars when others said it was impossible. Today they would honor that legacy and show the galaxy what humanity was made of, and she gave the order for all ships to go weapons-free. The 10 minutes expired and Vren sneered at the lack of response and told his fleet to advance and show the humans the price of defiance. The Valorian fleet moved forward like a tide of destruction with their weapon systems charging and ready to overwhelm Earth's defenses through sheer numbers alone. But as they crossed into the inner system, something unexpected happened, because from hiding positions behind asteroids and from dormant orbits that had seemed like space debris and from the far side of the moon, human ships appeared. Not 300 ships as intelligence had suggested, but 500, because smaller craft had been built in secret and hidden from prying eyes, and positioned for exactly this moment. Wilson ordered them to spring the trap, and the battle for Earth began as human forces engaged the Valorian fleet with everything they had. The space around Earth lit up with weapons fire and explosions as humanity fought for its survival against an empire that had never known defeat. Valorian ships were larger and more powerful, but human ships were faster and more maneuvering and fought with desperate courage that came from defending their only home. The battle raged for hours as both sides took heavy casualties, and the Valorians began to realize that conquering Earth would cost far more than they had anticipated. Vren watched in growing frustration as his numerical advantage meant nothing against enemies who refused to surrender, and fought with tactics he had never encountered before. The command center on Earth chronicler Tash watched the battle unfold alongside the other elder species representatives, and murmured that humans never cease to surprise, because in 4 years they had learned what takes most species 4 decades to master. Elder Mira asked if humanity would survive this test, and Tash's ancient eyes held something that might have been hope, as he replied that they were all about to find out. As the battle continued, Wilson coordinated her forces with precision, and Paul watched the tactical display showing human ships using guerrilla tactics and hit-and-run attacks that frustrated the Valorian formations. The Valorians had expected an easy victory over a primitive species, but instead they found themselves locked in brutal combat against an enemy that adapted and improvised.